So far in this course, I've described how to make simple HTTP requests, retrieving text and binary-based content. But to work with most web services, you need to know how to send parameters, values that the web service expects that lets it filter data or take other actions. I'm working in a version of my project called packparams, and I've stripped this version of the project back a bit so that it once again only displays text. When I run this version of the app in the emulator and click the action bar item, I'm retrieving the JSON formatted data from the web feed. But now I'm going to describe how to send information to the server. I'll start in a browser. To demonstrate this, I've placed a PHP file on the browser. It's at this location, services.hanselandpedal.com/restful.php. And I've provided a copy of that file in the exercise files under Assets, PHP. This is what the file looks like. It's a very simple PHP script. It echoes the request methods such as get, post, put, or delete, and then echoes each request parameter. It uses a for each loop, and each parameter has a key and a value, both strings, and outputs the key and value separated with an equals operator. Here's how this behaves in a web browser. If I just make the request to the PHP file, I get back the string getRequest. That's being done by this line of code. But if I add parameters, such as a name and a role, then I get back those values as well. In the browser, it looks like it's all on one line, but this PHP file isn't designed to return HTML, it's designed to return plain text, and this is what the response really looks like. So my goal is to be able to send parameters to the server and get back this sort of response. I'll start with describing how you can package parameters so that you can easily pass them around in an Android application. Remember that to make an HTTP request, you need to use an async task, and async tasks require generic typing. The input is a single type, and a complex request includes a lot of different values. The URI where you're sending the request to, the request method, and a set of parameters. So before I start working on the main application, I'm going to describe a strategy for packaging up all that information into a single class. I'll go to my application's main package, and from there go into the new class wizard. And I'll create a new class that I'll call Request Package. You could name this anything you want. The class will have 3 private fields. The first one will be a string that I'll call URI. That'll be the address that I'm sending the request to. The second will be another string, and this will be called method. I'll initialize this to a value of get. That'll be the default, but I'll be able to override that and change it to something like post. And finally, I'll set up a way of containing the parameters. An HTTP request can have as many parameters as you want, and each parameter will be a key-value pair. Both the key and the value will be strings. I'll store these as a map. I'll type map and press Control space, and choose the map interface from java.util. And then I'll set the data type for both the key and the value to string. And I'll name it params. I'll also initialize this object immediately using new hash map. And so I have a place to put my parameters from the very beginning. Next, I'll generate the getters and setters. Right-click anywhere and choose Source, Generate Getters and Setters. Select all, place the insertion point after the last member, and click OK. And that creates the standard getters and setters. Now this class could be enough, but I'm going to add another couple of features that'll make it even easier to use. Instead of having the application set all of the parameters at the same time, as is currently required with the setParams method, I'm going to allow the app to set one parameter at a time, with a new method that I'll call setParam. It'll take 2 arguments, both strings named key and value. And it'll have just a single line of code. params.put, and then I'll pass in the key and value. So when I call this method from anywhere in the app, I'm adding a parameter to the package. Next, I'll also create a method that allows me to retrieve the parameters as an encoded string. Going back to the browser and to my PHP file, I'll show you what a query string looks like in the web. It always starts off with a question mark, and then the values are separated by key and value with equals operators. And then, if you have more than one parameter, you're separating them from each other with an ampersand. But you also have to deal with specially encoded characters. For instance, if I put in a space and the letter G for my first name and press Enter, notice how Chrome changes that from a space character to an encoded character. %20 is the encoded version of a space. It's up to you in Android to encode your query string properly so that it's sent over the web and received by PHP or whatever web service environment is being used on the server. So that'll be the next step. Going back to the request package class, I'll create another public method, but this will return a string, and I'll name it getEncodedParams. Now this will take a little bit of work to put together, so I'll use a string builder. I'll name it SB and initialize it with the noArguments constructor. Now I'm going to loop through my parameters. Let's assume that somewhere in the app I have code that's set 2 parameters. The map will contain those parameters now, and I'll use a for each code template to iterate over them. On each time through the loop, I'll start with a string that I'll name key. This will be the key of one of the parameters. And to get those keys, I'll use the expression params.keyset. That returns a set of keys for all the parameters, and then I can loop through those. Within the for loop, I'll create a string called value, and I'll set that with params.get, and I'll pass in the key. So now I have a key and I have a value. Next, I need to look at the existing parameter string. If this is the first time in the loop, then the string will be empty, and I don't need to add anything to it. But for all subsequent parameters, I'll need to append that ampersand character. So I'll use an if statement, and I'll set the condition to sb.length greater than 0. That means take this action only if the string already has something in it. And if it does, I'll use sb.append, and I'll append a literal ampersand. Now I'm ready to append the new parameter. I'll use sb.append, and I'll append the key, and then I'll append an equals operator. And then I'm ready for the value. In order to encode the value, you'll use a class called URL encoder. You can do this either in the append method or up here when you retrieve the value. I'll do it here. I'll use the URL encoder class from java.net, and then I'll call the encode method. Notice there are 2 versions of this method, one with just a single argument and one with a character set name. The first one is actually deprecated. You don't want to use that version. Instead, use this one that expects 2 arguments. The first argument will be the value, and that's the value I'm getting from the parameters map by passing in the key. And then the second argument is a literal string. I'll set it to UTF-8. That'll be the character set name. After you finish that code, you'll see an error indicator, and I'll use a quick fix, and I'll wrap that line of code with a try-catch block. And then I'll come back down here to where I'm building my string, and I'll append the value. Notice that I don't have access to that value here, and that's because the declaration is in this try-catch block. So I'll move the declaration of the value variable outside the try block and then only populate it here. And that'll clean up that code. Once the loop is complete, my query string will be done, and I'll return its value with return sb.toString. I'll clean up this code, removing this comment and removing empty lines, and that's the finished code to get the encoded parameters. Now, I don't have a way of testing this code easily at the moment because I still have a good bit more work to do in the main application. But review this code and make sure you understand what it's doing and how it might be used. This request package class is pretty generic, and it can be used whenever you're working with complex web services. And I'll show you how to use it in an async task in the next movie.